I ended up by showing or telling you that macroeconomics really is composed of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And aggregate demand comes more from the Keynesian side of economics, and aggregate supply comes from supply economics. But the two interact and they form one model. But each side, on their own, they also composed of their own elementary models. From the aggregate demand side, we really are concerned with aggregate expenditure and what comprises the components of aggregate expenditure. Keynes proposed that aggregate expenditure was influenced or determined by national consumption. It was also influenced by private investments. It was also influenced by government spending. It was also influenced by international markets. And international markets would be composed of exports and imports. In this course, we're not really going to dwell on this variable, but we're going to focus on these three variables. And in fact, this sector, aggregate demand, this really is representative of your goods and services market. So this is your goods and services market. The goods and services market is linked to financial markets or money markets through this variable. So this variable, because investments really are determined by the level of interest rates, and the level of interest rate, and the level of interest rate really indicates to us the price of money. The price of money. So people go to banks and borrow money at a particular price, which is the interest rate, and then they take that money and they invest it in different projects. So that is the link. Private investment is really the link between our goods and services market and our money markets. You know what happens with banks, and that link is through the interest rate. So for now, let's just focus on aggregate expenditure and develop this model that Keynes gave to us, where he proposed during a time of a Great Depression in America that to stimulate output or to stimulate national income, government would have to be involved in the market by stimulating those variables, so as to stimulate aggregate expenditure. And at equilibrium, the national output would then be high. So for an increase here or there would increase your aggregate expenditure, and that would increase the level of national income at equilibrium. So let's develop our model one by one, looking at aggregate expenditure and its relationship to consumption and how they both act on national income. So really what we are interested in is to look at how these two variables are related to each other: aggregate expenditure and national income. So if on your y-axis you had aggregate expenditure, on your x-axis you have got national income. By the way, national income is also, in macroeconomics, is also referred to as output. Okay, so output is also is the same thing, it's the same variable within macroeconomics. And we also represent this variable by big Y, not the small y that represents the y-axis. Anyway, what this guy said was that basically if aggregate expenditure is only dependent on consumption, an improvement in consumption would increase national income by a higher proportion than there was an increase in national income. And he proposed that even if national income is zero, communities still continue to consume. In this case, what would that mean is that there would be some relationship between consumption and national income represented by the slope. If you remember back to our discussion of a linear slope, and that relationship would be the slope of the consumption function. And the intercept would really just represent a level of aggregate expenditure even when national income was zero. So this would be our y-intercept. So the form of this equation really is such that consumption equals to some intercept A plus this relationship, the slope, which would be the B coefficient, and then the X there, which in this case is national income. And that therefore would mean that if we had an example, for instance, where the intercept, the level of consumption when national income was zero, say for instance it was $100 billion. And the idea is that even if national income is zero, people do still, they are still alive, so they are spending. They could be spending from savings, they could be spending from borrowing, whatever source they could be spending from. But the point is, there is some level of aggregate expenditure, even if national income was zero. So, this is just an example, and you could imagine that this relationship, the slope of that line was some ratio, say 0.75, and the x really here is national income. That could be our example, for instance, of the consumption function. So we call this the consumption function, because really that's a relationship between consumption and national income. So what did this guy say? This guy said if consumption function were to be improved, that would have an effect on aggregate expenditure, and that would mean that that would push up aggregate expenditure and therefore push up national output. How did he explain this? Well, it was simple really. He said that at equilibrium you should have your aggregate expenditure equals to national income. And that means that at any point along a line where y equals to x, and that was 45 degrees, that was 45 degrees, your aggregate expenditure would equals to your national income. Your aggregate expenditure would equals to your national income. So anywhere along this line, you are at national equilibrium in terms of income. So when you are asked to work out equilibrium output, you should always say that y equals to x, any point where y equals to x. And what is y in this case is AE. What is x? X is national income. And the big Y, remember, big Y is national income, and this Y is just the y-axis. So anywhere along this line, aggregate expenditure equals to national income. And that's when your whole economy is at equilibrium. So what's the relationship between this equilibrium and our consumption function? So our consumption function is a function that has its own slope. Whilst this function y equals to x, or AE equals to y, its slope would be 1. Meaning that the relationship between AE and national income is 1:1. 1:1 relationship. Anyway, our example of a consumption was somewhere where our aggregate expenditure or our consumption was 100, even if national income was 0, in a case where aggregate expenditure was only composed of consumption. So really our intercept would be there. And if we have that line, this line is our consumption function, where consumption equals to 100 plus, and we said maybe the slope would be 0.75 y. Y, which is our national income. So that was the example that we gave to ourselves as the consumption function that we can work with here. Anyway, what this guy said, that at equilibrium, you know what equilibrium is, where aggregate expenditure equals to Y. And in this case, aggregate expenditure is only composed of consumption. And this is our consumption. Consumption equals to 100 plus 0.75 Y, where 0.75 really represents the marginal propensity to consume. Anyway, where AE equals Y, i.e. along this line, you are at equilibrium. Therefore, whenever AE, or consumption in this case, because AE is consumption equals to Y, you are at equilibrium. This is our consumption, this is our equilibrium line where everything is equal. Therefore, that would mean that at that point, your economy is at equilibrium. So if your aggregate expenditure was only comprised of consumption, this guy Keynes said that if you stimulated consumption, if you increased consumption, for instance, you increased consumption, you would find that that increase there, of consumption would be accompanied by a greater increase in terms of that change there. So you increase your consumption, you move up your consumption function, your next level of equilibrium output would be there, where your new consumption function crosses this equilibrium line, Y equals to X, at a point where your national output would have increased by a much bigger portion. So then he was advising government that if they pushed up any of the factors or variables that influence aggregate expenditure, they would have that effect on national income. So he proposed that this kind of thinking was used at a time where there was a recession, that government should adopt aggregate demand-side measures to stimulate aggregate expenditure, which would then stimulate national income, which would then stimulate the level of employment. And when you add up all the other variables on your aggregate expenditure model, you will see that if, for instance, you suddenly have investment as part of your model, so your aggregate expenditure is not only composed of consumption, but it is also composed of investment, and it is also composed of government. If you increased your level of investment, you will have the same effect. You'll push up your consumption function, and your consumption function will move up. And at this point, because now it includes investment, therefore along this line, your aggregate expenditure equals your consumption function, which is this function, plus the amount by which you increased your level of investment. So by increasing investment or introducing investment onto your consumption function, shifts up the consumption function parallel to itself. Because really the level of investment is going to affect your whole economy. Your whole economy will be affected by an improvement in investment or introduction of investment everywhere. It doesn't matter whether your national income is 10. If you add on your investment, it sort of goes up by the same amount, whether it is 10 or it's 20 or it's 50. So you have this parallel shift of your consumption function by having added investment onto it. And the same applies when we add the government spending onto our function. So really that's what this, in theory, what Keynes proposed was that if you imagine that your aggregate expenditure was composed of these variables, then government would have to stimulate either consumption, private consumption, and or investment and or government expenditure. And the improvements at national equilibrium would be greater, would be much greater than the stimulus package that you introduced into your aggregate expenditure. So this is where you do the stimulation, these are the effects, and the effects are much bigger. And the reason why they're so much bigger is because of what he called the multiplier effect. The multiplier effect. In your textbook, you are given the formula of the multiplier effect, and it is affected by your marginal propensity to consume. So the slope of the consumption curve. The slope of the consumption curve. And it is given as 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. You know, so if you are given the marginal propensity to consume, you can work out what the multiplier effect is, by how much, the factor by which your national income is going to increase. Right? And it's related to the slope of your consumption function. But the point is that just improve your aggregate expenditure, add on to your consumption by adding investment or adding government expenditure, and shift up your consumption function, and have your aggregate expenditure equals to the consumption plus the investment. You know, you can improve it and increase it and add government, which gives it a parallel shift outward. What you will find is that this line there is going to go, and at some point it is going to intersect your aggregate expenditure, and you can see that your national income would have improved by a lot more than your improvements on the aggregate expenditure side. So now I would like for us to work out an example of how to work out national equilibrium. Sometimes we could be given all these other factors. You know, we could be told to work out equilibrium output, where we know what the level of consumption is. For instance, we could be told that consumption equals to 150, say for instance, $billion, and we could be told that investment equals to 100. And we could be told that government expenditure equals to 50, and then we could be asked, work out what the level of national equilibrium is, national income equilibrium is. And what did we say earlier on was that always at equilibrium, your aggregate expenditure should equals to Y. Your aggregate expenditure should equals to Y. So if that is the case, and we also know that aggregate expenditure equals to consumption plus investment plus government spending, for which we are given as 150 plus 100 plus 50, then and aggregate expenditure was Y, then we can easily add up all these variables and work out equilibrium, the equilibrium level of national income. But it's not always the case that we are given. It's not always the case that we are given, especially the consumption variable. Sometimes we are not given this information to just plug on to our equation. Sometimes we have to work out why. If we're only given the function and we're not given the value of the function. And that is the example that I want for us to work with next.